This is your rector's microphone here.
My introduction is now over. I'm pleased to present Rabbi Micah Greenstein.
Oh, you're on. How do you follow that? You follow it by saying how grateful I am not only to be here, but for my relationship with Richard and Joseph. I think many of you have lived through this period of interfaith, but the good news is we've moved beyond goodwill. We've moved to a stage of very deep dialogue, and today's talk, just like last week's and next week, gives me an opportunity to not only to prepare and to study, but to share our shared scripture together. I actually want to pick up where your rector left off last week. He probably didn't realize the power of the moment. He ended our session with a moment of silence. Now, why is that significant? Because last week, on Sunday, it was the Remembrance Day of the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah. And in Israel, at exactly the same time that your rector spontaneously asked us to just have a moment after my talk on war and peace in Scripture, at 10 o'clock in Israel, the whole country stops for 2 minutes. They get out on the highway if you're driving. They stand at attention remembering the 6 million. Well, guess what? Today, 1 week after Holocaust Remembrance Day, is another holiday in Israel. It is known as Yom HaZikaron. It's the holiday that honors veterans and fallen military personnel of the Israel Defense Forces who have died in the 7 major wars. 7 wars in 66 years, 20,000 killed, 75,000 wounded, 100,000 veterans. In fact, most people don't know this, but in the War of Independence in 1948, 47 to 49 was the actual war, 6,373, many of whom were survivors of the Holocaust, died in the War of Israel's independence. So 1 out of every 4 citizens in Israel was a Holocaust survivor. And then 2 years later, after the UN partition plan, Israel ends up losing 6,373 of its only 640,000 Jewish people in Palestine, including every man, woman, and child, which means 1% was killed in that first war. We have 310 million Americans, I believe, which would be the equivalent of 3.1 million Americans dying in a war. And that's why on this day, it begins with a moment of silence, standing in silence, showing respect, commemorating the fallen. A 2-minute siren is heard. And then, this is why I wanted to share it, it's something for us to remember as Americans. Immediately after the flag that has been lowered to half-mast is returned to full mast on Mount Herzl. They celebrate their Independence Day, which is tomorrow, the anniversary of the state, to remind people of the price paid for independence and of what was achieved with the soldiers' sacrifice. So this transition is something I think we in America could stand to learn from. We have a Memorial Day, which is basically a vacation for families. And then we have an Independence Day, which is another time for baseball, hot dogs, and apple pie. But as we move into the voice of prophecy and the voice of poetry, I hope we don't forget last week's topic about moving to a time of peace from a time of war. So I want to begin by talking about poetry, move to prophecy, and then come back to poetry, and hopefully end on a sense of humor, because God must have a sense of humor. Just look at us. The Hebrew of our scriptures, known as the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, you ought to know contains few abstractions, which is why the poetry in the Bible, the voice of God through poetry, teems with concrete images and may strike we moderns as anthropomorphic when it comes to God. But this was the only way in which the poets of the Bible, hearing God's voice, were able to express their thoughts. If you look in the dictionary, poetry, it says, is the art of rhythmical composition, which features beautiful, imaginative, or elevated thoughts. Biblical poems rarely feature rhyme and are instead distinguished by their content and their meter. And while their meter is an important part of the structure of biblical poetry, it's the content that's the distinguishing feature. So, for instance, Deuteronomy 32, Moses' farewell song, is one long poem. Let me take you to 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 3. Listen to it. I'm going to read it to you in Hebrew and then in English. Elohei tsuri echesabo, magini vekeren yish'i, mosh'i mechamas toshieni, miskabi uminusi. You hear the E. You hear some of the rhyming, right? Well, here's what it means. In your Bibles, it probably says something like this. God is my rock where I seek shelter, my shield, the source of my salvation, my deliverer, you save me from violence. By the word, the name Hamas, which is the name of the occupiers of Gaza right now, that's the word in the scripture. It means violence. Note that each line contains basically the same thought. God is my rock where I seek shelter, my shield, the source of my salvation, my deliverer, you save me from violence. Basically the same thought. This is called synonymous parallelism. And the entire poem has these parallels. There's another type, I'm not going to make you fall asleep, I promise, I'm going to get this out of the way, which is called antithetic parallelism, where the second line is the opposite of the first line. So listen to this one from Isaiah 54:7. I know you know this one. I won't read this one in Hebrew, but only in English. The prophet, speaking through God, is talking to the Jewish people, the Israelites. For a brief moment, I forsook you. In love, I took you back. Right? That's antithetic parallelism because the second line is the opposite of the first. You might have guessed that there's a third type called synthetic parallelism, in which the succeeding line expands on what precedes it. So let's take Habakkuk 3:15. Here's an example of that. You, God, tread the sea with your steeds, churning the mighty waters. So churning expands on treading. And another feature of biblical poetry is repetition, either of the same words or of the same thought. So let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 38 and 39. This is going to be an example of biblical poetry that is repetitious with words of the same thought. Here we go. I chase my foes and destroy them. I do not turn back till they are no more. I destroy them. I shatter them. You get the picture. These are just a few aspects of this mode of biblical writing we call poetry. And it continues to this day, and I want to move since it's the eve of Israel Independence Day. There are national poets. Do kids today memorize who is our Robert Frost? Who is America's poet laureate? In Israel, kids all learn poetry. And the national poet there is a guy named Bialik, B-I-A-L-I-K. And you can look it up later. I'm just going to quote from his famous poem called The City of Slaughter, which really explains modern Hebrew poetry versus medieval or ancient Jewish poetry. What do I mean? Until this century, Jews were always objects of history, never subjects. They were always powerless, and I explored this last week, that when you're powerless, you want God to be your warrior to fight for you, right? And so Bialik and most of these immigrants to Israel from the 103 different countries they came, many of them came from Eastern Europe or Central Europe. If you ask anyone you know who's Jewish, where is your ancestry? Where'd they come from? Most will say Eastern Europe or Russia. That's why most Jews in this country look like Barbra Streisand. Some came from Central Europe. If you meet a Catholic from Poland, they'll look that way too, right? But in the 1880s, when times got really hard, Catherine the Great, and I'm looking at Honey, and I know that we had a great Wonders exhibit. She was great when it came to art. She wasn't so great when it came to the Jews. There were the Pale of Settlement, and the Cossacks, Fiddler on the Roof, great, great Broadway show. It was horrible for Jews. You had random raids and riots and pogroms. Well, the proverbial chara hit the fan, that's Hebrew, when in 1903 there was a terrible riot against Jews called the Kishinev pogroms. Kishinev, where thousands of Jews were slaughtered, women, children, men. And Bialik, the poet, wrote this poem called The City of Slaughter. Listen to, I'm going to read you part of it. It's a very long poem. Arise and go now to the city of slaughter, Kishinev, into its courtyard wind thy way. Descend to the cellars of the town, there where the virginal daughters of thy folk were fouled, where 7 heathen flung a woman down, the daughter in the presence of her mother. Crushed in their shame, they saw it all. They did not stir nor move. They did not pluck their eyes out. They beat not their brains against the wall. Perhaps, each watcher, he's talking about the men who are watching this, had it in his heart to pray, a miracle, O Lord, and spare my skin this day. Those who survived this foulness, who from their blood awoke, beheld their life polluted, the light of their world gone out. How did their menfolk bear it? How did they bear this yoke? They crawled out forth from their holes. They fled to the house of the Lord, the synagogue. They offered thanks to him, singing psalms of praise, the sweet benedictory word. The priests sallied forth to the rabbi's house, and they asked the rabbi, "Tell me, O Rabbi, when is my own wife permitted to me?" The matter ends, and nothing more, and all is as it was before. The passivity of these Jews in the face of the mobs, the air of the Hasmoneans lay with trembling knees, concealed and cowering, the son of the Maccabees, the seed of saints, the scions of the lions, who crammed by scores in all the sanctuary of their shame, so sanctified my name. It was the fight of mice they fled. The scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs, and they were dead. Why do I share this? Because Bialik was more knowledgeable about Talmud, about Bible, about next week's topic I'll share with you, Midrash. He was a descendant of rabbis. But he said, enough. Enough of the inhumanity and incivility and rape and violence. Enough of the facile theological answers you heard in this long poem. After witnessing what they did to our women and children, you go to the rabbi and you ask him, when can we sleep together again? It's not that they turned their back on religion. It's that they wanted to become the subject of history. And that's why when you go to the Holy Land, don't just go to the ancient sites. Go to the modern sites and you'll notice something very interesting. In Tel Aviv, you go to Jerusalem, it's all alleyways, you know, when you visit the old city. The Jewish homes have courtyards off the main road because you didn't know if you'd be attacked. And then behind the courtyards is where people have their bedrooms and their living rooms. There was a movement called the Bauhaus movement in architecture in Germany. Many of you know the Bauhaus movement. Hitler, of course, got rid of Bauhaus, and most of the architects, or many of them, were Jewish, but it was more than architecture. It was a pure form, white city, Tel Aviv is known as. In Tel Aviv, the Bauhaus, 4,000 buildings still standing, they have balconies. Now you say, what's the big deal about a balcony? It was a way that this poet, Bialik, could say, we are going to live like normal people. We're going to have cafes. We're going to drink coffee. We're not going to hide and cower behind desks and worry if the Cossacks are going to come do what they did to our men, women, and children. We have arrived in the world. We just want to be like everyone else. We want to sit on our balcony on Sunday morning and drink coffee. This is all expressed in poetry, my friends. Let's move to prophecy. Prophetic books in the Bible that we share fall into two parts. There's the early prophets, which are the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And why are they listed among the prophets if they're historical books? Because prophetic figures appear like Joshua, Deborah, Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha. Many of Jesus' miracles may be seen in light of Elijah and Elisha. However, with few exceptions, the early prophets have no literary material. So therefore, we have not the early historical prophets, but the later prophets who are also called literary prophets. And these are 15 individuals whose prophetic legacies name a specific prophet. The three who gave us the most extensive writings, they're called the major prophets because of how much material we have. You know them: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. While the 12 we refer to as the minor prophets because their surviving literary heritage is relatively small, sometimes only a few pages, are not minor when it comes to their major orations, like Hosea, Amos, Micah. So minor refers to the quantity but not the quality of their literary work. I don't have as much time as I want today to go into this subject, but let me give you a headline. Prophets were not weather forecasters. They were more like editorial writers. We tend to think of prophets primarily as people who foretold the future. And such foretelling was an important part of their message, but they were not fortune tellers. Their message was usually, if you continue on your current paths and disregard what the Creator wants us to do, then disaster lies ahead. But they continue, if you would turn from your evil ways, then you will live and enjoy the blessing of life and God's favor. They would describe both misfortune and good fortune in vivid detail. So the prophet usually predicts what should be and delivers this prediction with a sense of certainty, including the messianic redemption. It is what should be, but whether it will be depends, at least to some extent, on you and me, on us. Now, what the prophet said was sometimes highly unpopular. For example, and as you know, Jeremiah courted death, was jailed for announcing the impending doom for following this path. At other times, when the people faced depression and despair, the prophet would give the people hope by stressing that divine mercy is always available, repentance, you can always turn things around. True prophets, by the way, there were false prophets. Go see Deuteronomy 13, talks about false prophets. True prophets knew that they spoke as messengers of God. They were possessed with divine fire, and they were convinced that God's Spirit guided their speech. The Hebrew word for prophet, the biblical word for prophet, navi, probably related to an Akkadian root, which means calling out or proclaiming. The Greek translation, which you know as the Septuagint, rendered the term navi as prophetes. That's why we know the word prophet, which is described as a spokesperson for God. So the true prophet did not convey a personal opinion, but proclaimed a divinely initiated message. After all is said and done, just words. That's all the prophet is saying about the invisible God, the Creator, the great mystery. But the prophet helps us to hear that mystery, that invisible God, that source of morality. The prophet helps us to see. But even more, the prophet helps us to think and says, it's up to you. One who has been divinely called is a good way to translate the word navi. My professor from the Hebrew Union College and my teacher's teacher, Sheldon Blank, professor of Bible, used to always say that there's a formula. The prophet always goes like this: thus saith the Lord, ko amar Adonai. Not I say, but thus saith the Lord. That's why when people ask, Jesus was obviously a Jewish teacher, was he a prophet? Well, he was, but technically, if you want to go by that, thus saith the Lord, no. Martin Luther King was a modern day prophet too, but he didn't say thus saith the Lord either. Listeners understood when they heard the prophet as a mouthpiece of God, and in this sense we could say that a Jesus, or was Moses a prophet? We're going to get to that. But here's the key idea. The prophets were not philosophers. They didn't speak as philosophers. They spoke as teachers. And instead of dealing with the timeless issues that, we like to talk about philosophically, theologically, like being and becoming, that's a good sermon title. Matter and form. Definitions and demonstrations. We always have to print our sermon titles in the bulletin, And I'm a student of history, so I study our archives. And Rabbi Wax of blessed memory, some of you may have known him, he had the greatest sermon title that I have lifted many times when I speak in other cities, when I don't have time to write my talk until 6:30 in the morning before the 9:30 session. And his title was At the Crossroads. It can be about anything. It can be about interfaith relations, stages of life. Anyway, the Nevi'im, the prophets, did not speak as philosophers. They spoke as teachers. The prophet threw themselves into orations not about matter and being, but about widows and orphans, about the corruption of judges and the affairs of the marketplace. So instead of showing us through the elegant mansions of the mind, the prophets take us to the slums. The world is a proud place full of beauty. But the prophets are scandalized and they rave as if the whole world were a slum. Why such indignation? Because the things that horrified the prophets, they argue, are daily occurrences. And I think you'd agree they're still daily occurrences if you read their rave. The prophets are now daily occurrences all over the world. Because of this, the prophetic challenge remains relevant today. The prophets apply to all human beings and to all societies. And with a special urgency, they address Jews. Every week, we don't just read from the 5 books of Moses. You always read from the prophets which accompany them. Yesterday morning when I led services, it was Ezekiel. I love the image that Abraham Joshua Heschel, who wrote the definitive work on the prophets, and one of the great 20th century philosophers, if you ever want to read Abraham Joshua Heschel on prophecy, he suggests that the prophets were trying to not shine the spotlight up to God, but to imagine God shining the spotlight down on us. And to imagine concentric circles a few blocks away from here, a mile away from here, 3 miles away from here. And to feel the pain, the divine pathos, he calls it, that God must feel. And that should be our preoccupation. And that's why the prophets were always, many of them came from very comfortable homes. But they were obsessed with the poor. In Numbers 12:8, it says, "When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is trusted throughout my household. With Moses, I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord." Elsewhere in Exodus at Mount Sinai, it says, "And all the people saw the voices." So, if the prophet hears and sees God, Moses is a prophet of God. Moses, according to Numbers 12:8, was unlike any other. What's the difference? I'm going to discuss Midrash next week, but just to give you a preview, it was said that Moses has one lens through which he sees God. The prophets use 9 lenses. Who has the advantage? One who has one lens or one who has 9? There is a verse in Ezekiel that refers to seeing, Re'eh, if you follow the Hebrew, 9 times in one verse. That's how they get the idea, that the prophet uses 9 lenses. Nero, the Roman emperor, there's an optical device he would take to the game to see the Colosseum games. He used it to enhance the gore. Sadly, we do the same thing today. They're called 3D horror movies, right? But let me sum it up, since we don't have much time, and I want to leave time for your questions as well, and I want to get back to poetry and end on a note of hope and humor. Moses sees God through one lens, the prophet through 9. You think that the advantage is 9. But Moses sees through a window. The prophet sees a mirror. What does that mean? The prophets are looking at themselves. They're pointing out we need to look at ourselves. By the way, not the prophets, but that's why religion can be so dangerous. This morning on so many stations, pastors will say, I'm using a lens to explain creation, but I'm really checking out myself. The other side is that looking within may be the best way of seeing God. God was out there, and our job is to try and reach that ethical standard. In other words, we all want to see God. But when Moses looked through his speculum, he realized that there's nothing to see. That the oneness gets obscured through all these different lenses. The prophet does have a more finely tuned sense of vision. The extremist problem is that he sees the world through one eye and denies a fusion of perspectives. So the prophet has more lenses, you might say, more antennae, like looking at us from 30,000 feet as we scurry about and worry about this weekend's plan, next weekend's plans, Memphis in May. So much positive, by the way, I'm doing a wedding this weekend, it's not the royal wedding. So much positivity about Memphis, the Grizzlies. It is important and should not be de-emphasized, but the prophets say, don't forget the slum. Don't forget the widow and orphan. And don't go to some theological abstraction. So, let me return to poetry and show you how beautiful it is and how it's... Next week I'm going to make a jarring statement that Judaism without the Old Testament is unthinkable, but Judaism with only the Old Testament isn't Judaism. This legacy of poetry and of prophecy, the obsession, the reason why a lot of people think out of 1 million citizens in Memphis, I always play this game, I may have shared it with you, how many people are Jewish in Memphis out of over 1 million people? 10% is 100,000, right? There are no more than maybe 9,000 Jews, less than 1%, 0.9%. So a lot of my community friends say, that's impossible, Micah. And what do you mean it's impossible? But look at all the Jews involved in MIFA and food bank and victims of child sexual abuse. And there's no way that only 0.8% of Memphis is Jewish, less than 1%. I said, yes it is. And I said, how does that square with what I just told you, Mike? And I said, they're the same people. So prophecy and the impulse of the prophets, prophetic Judaism is it's another name for my movement of Judaism. It's called prophetic Judaism. We're supposed to live out the words of the prophets. Poetry. There's a beautiful poet, Solomon ibn Gabirol. He lived from 1020 to 1057. He was born in Malaga. He signed his poems Malki. He was taken to Saragossa, where he became a genius in Bible and Talmud. But poetry became his passion. He was orphaned at an early age. He wrote a number of tributes to his father. On his mother's death, he mourned both of his parents. He complained of his weak physique, his ugliness. It's apparent that he was frequently ill in his childhood. I gave you the dates, 1020 to 1057. Only lived 37 years. He likened himself to a 16-year-old with the heart of an 80-year-old. You know people like that, right? But listen to what he does in his poetry. In Hebrew, in the Bible, the word for a dark time is shachor. S-H is one letter. C-H, that's the hard word to say in Hebrew, is the other letter, and R, right? There are no vowels in the Bible. No vowels, just 22 consonants. With the slightest revocalization of the same letters, guess what those same letters spell? The dawn of a new day. And Ibn Gabiro wrote a poem when he was suffering, and he said, just look to the Bible, because the letters, when you're engulfed by the darkest night of despair, shachor, it's worth remembering that if we cling to the thread of life, precious and fragile as it may be, the darkness will eventually give way to the dawn, when the sun will be bright again with all sorts of unsuspected possibilities. And he expresses this so beautifully in poetry. So, Jewish haiku. My Uncle Jay, the surgeon. I don't know, a bunch of these doctors, they just must spend all their time passing jokes. Most I can't share from the pulpit. So, you know where it is. It's one, it's 575, right? Is that how it works? Okay. And then the third line is going to be a Jewish response. After the warm rain, the sweet smell of camellias, did you wipe your feet? Her lips near my ear, Aunt Sadie whispers the name of her friend's disease. Today I am a man, bar mitzvah. Tomorrow I will return to the 7th grade. Wet moss on the old stones, lying in the grass, I ponder who to sue. Now, putz is an anatomical part, is someone who's not a good person is called a putz, right? So you need to know that by way of background for the next one. Harsh Scrabble discord. Someone has placed putz head on. A triple word score. Testing the warm milk on her wrist, she sighs softly, but her son is 40. The sparkling blue sea reminds me to wait an hour after my sandwich. I don't want to, I'll just do a few more. Uncle Jay has an encyclopedia. Tea ceremony. Fragrant steam perfumes the air. Try the cheese Danish. Just one more. Our holiest day of the year is not Easter, it's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, right? Yom Kippur, forgive me, Lord, for the Mercedes and all that lobster. So, the sense of humor continues, and I'm going to open it up to questions. We have till 10:20. I just want to give everyone a homework assignment. Our Memphian friend, dear friend of mine, Alan Lightman, wrote a very important piece in the New York Times yesterday called Our Lonely Home in Nature. The gist of it is that Mother Earth doesn't actually care about you at all. The reason that we should care about the planet is because nature really doesn't care about you. We have to care about ourselves. We have to protect ourselves, so save ourselves. And it's a prophetic piece. That's why I bring it up. It relates back to that thread of reminding us to look out for each other and to take care of everyone we can. Others who have questions, please. I know we need to end at 10:20. It's amazing. It's wonderful not only to prepare, but to see so many people attentive and present and listening. It's a blessing to be with you. Next week we'll wrap it up with hearing God's voice through Midrash. But anything about prophecy, poetry, or Jewish haiku? Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, you're going to ask me that. I'll have to go back. I'll have to, I don't have this, I'll show you. If you look up in a concordance, Resh Aleph Hey, and you'll see where it appears 9 times to see. That's where the idea came from. Yes, sir?
Why are prophets usually not honored in their own country?
It's a brilliant question. You know the phrase, Ein Navi Be'iro, which means no one's a prophet in his own hometown, which is why most rectors and rabbis, when they retire, go on the traveling tour. It's my fear when I speak here or at Calvary, people are going to say, Rabbi, we know that the environment's an important thing, but why do you recycle your sermons? And I can't do that. I think it's because, I'm not a psychologist, hopefully someone here can analyze this psychologically. You ever notice how we like outsiders to come in and to, this celebrity is in town and they speak and weren't they a great speaker and then they leave. It was kind of like the Freedom Riders in the 60s who went back to New York or Chicago, come down here, speak out justly against segregation and then leave. I think it's hard to tell the truth. And I think people want to feel good. I mean, that's why Joel Osteen is such a powerful voice on TV, I think. It's feel good. And if prophets are meant to not only comfort the afflicted, but afflict the comfortable, you're not going to be very popular. And it's been said that that is the mission of the prophet, to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And the latter isn't a popular way to go. So I think that's why. But you can always be a guest speaker in Barbados or Aruba, and you can afflict them for like an hour and then leave, right? Yes. Please, others. It's almost 10:20. What time is it? I'm sorry. I hope I'm on time. Am I keeping you? 15. Oh, good. Okay, we're on time. Great. Others? Everything you always want to ask the rabbi, but we're afraid to ask. It doesn't have to be about war, peace, prophecy, or poetry. Yes, ma'am.
You never quite answered the question whether Moses was a prophet or not. He had a window versus the lens.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Moses was not only a prophet, he was the prophet of prophets, you might say. But this is what's very interesting about Judaism. We just finished our Passover holiday. And we have a Seder, which means order, where we relive the experience of the Exodus. You don't say once upon a time Jews were slaves. You have to eat cardboard for 7 days to remember that you were slaves, right? You have to inhale horseradish until you feel it through your nasal passages. Right? But in all seriousness, guess whose name is absent from the original Haggadah? Moses. As if to say, while a prophet is a spokesman for God, no one man or woman is God alone. You might say that, yes, we believe that God incarnates himself, but in everyone. And to make the point that Moses was not the one responsible for the exodus from Egypt, but God was, they omit his name even though he was the chief prophet. So a prophet is not God any more than she or you or I are God. God is within each of us. It's just that prophets, just like my wife, God gave her a gift called calligraphy and art. My handwriting is so illegible, it's called microglyphics. So the prophet has an attuned sense of seeing what's happening in society and warning the people of impending doom, or seeing the despair and giving them hope, just as Solomon ibn Gabirol did 1,000 years later in Spain. So thank you for following up. Yes, the question is, how technical do you want to get by the term? Moses is called a Navi, which is a prophet, but the literary, historical prophets all follow that "thus saith the Lord" mantra. I see my rector and friend coming forward, so thank you again for having me today.